All right, so, everyone's fascinated by this whole idea of like the mask of sanity, right? Like, how can someone seem so normal but actually be, a psychopath?
Yeah.
It's creepy, but also kind of fascinating. And we're using this book by Hervey Cleckley to guide this deep dive. And he was the psychiatrist back in the 40s.
Mm.
And his case studies are like, whoa, still so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. Cleckley's work is like, it really makes you think differently about psychopathy. The first thing you notice is he doesn't just like give you a definition like, here's what a psychopath is.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It's like he's saying, hold on, it's not that simple. So why not just tell us straight up?
Because Cleckley, he wants us to like move past those labels,
Yeah.
the ones we throw around without really understanding.
Mm.
He's saying psychopathy isn't just one thing. One of his biggest points is that psychopaths aren't always like these violent criminals you see in the movies.
Right.
They can be charming, successful, blend in perfectly. That's where the whole mask idea comes from.
That's so unsettling. So
Yeah.
if they can seem normal, how do we spot them? What gives them away?
Cleckley says the core issue is this lack of real emotional depth. They might understand emotions like intellectually, but they don't actually feel them the same way. It's like they're missing this crucial piece that allows for real connection.
Okay, that makes sense in theory, but I need some examples here. That's where the case studies come in, right?
Exactly. He uses these real-life examples to show just how complex psychopathy is.
Hmm.
And one of the most interesting cases is this guy, Max.
Oh, yeah, Max. He was something else. A whole history of petty crimes, fraud, you name it. And he was good at manipulating people, too. Sometimes he even seemed kind of intellectual. It made me think, like, maybe there's a different kind of street smarts, intelligence at play here. Like, are their brains just wired differently?
That's a great question, and it gets at this paradox we often see with psychopaths. They can be so quick-witted, able to think on their feet and manipulate, but then they make these choices that are self-destructive. It makes you wonder about, like, impulse control and how that fits into our whole definition of intelligence.
Right. And remember that story about Max claiming he went to Heidelberg University?
Oh, yeah. That's a perfect example of how they use information to make themselves seem more impressive.
That's like he was playing this game. I wonder if the lying itself was like the reward for him. More than anything, he actually gained from it.
It's fascinating, right? Their motives can be so hard to figure out. And sometimes it really seems like the manipulation eye is the goal.
Then there's Roberta. She was described as charming, harmless at first, but she was constantly doing these impulsive, almost random things. Stealing, running away, manipulating people. Like she was always looking for trouble, but with no clear motive.
What's unsettling about Roberta is that there's just zero remorse or anxiety about her actions. Imagine doing something you knew was wrong and just not feeling any guilt afterwards. It's that lack of emotional depth that makes her behavior so hard to grasp.
There's this story that really stuck with me. She ends up stranded in some new town with no money. You'd think she'd be freaking out.
Yeah.
But she manages to convince this random family to take her in for the night with some made-up story.
It's like she has this natural talent for reading people, finding their weak spots and using them. And the scariest part, she doesn't even hesitate.
It's like she saw people as pawns in her own game. So we've got the master manipulator, the impulsive free spirit, but then there's Arnold. He was the king of self-sabotage, intelligent, charming, yet he always found a way to mess things up.
Arnold's case is frustrating because he seemed to genuinely understand the consequences of his actions. He'd apologize, promise to do better, and then bam, right back to the same destructive behaviors. It makes you wonder if there's some disconnect between understanding and actually feeling the weight of those consequences.
It's like an endless cycle. He convinces his doctors he's ready for parole, and then what does he do? Sneaks whiskey, gets wasted, creates chaos. It's like he couldn't help himself, even when it was clearly not in his best interest.
Exactly. It's as if something inside him is just driving him to do these things, even when he knows better.
Cleckley called it a frustrating pattern, which is a perfect description. These cases are so fascinating, but it feels like Cleckley is trying to tell us something bigger here. He's not just sharing these individual stories, right?
You're right. He wants us to think about how these traits might show up in other areas. He even looks at historical figures who might have had psychopathic tendencies.
Like Alcibiades, the Athenian general,
Yeah.
brilliant military strategist, super charismatic, but also impulsive and reckless, ultimately causing more harm than good.
It's interesting, right? If we start to see historical figures through this lens, it could change how we understand events, especially for someone like you who loves history. It really makes you rethink things.
Totally, it adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Yeah.
But even with these case studies and the historical stuff, it seems like Cleckley is struggling with something. What was his biggest frustration when it comes to psychopathy?
He was really bothered by the lack of a clear and effective way to deal with psychopathy. Back then, it was often misdiagnosed or treated as just a legal problem, not a medical one. Traditional therapy didn't seem to work very well either, because like we said, psychopaths often struggle with self-reflection and emotional engagement.
So are we saying there's no hope for treatment or change? Is that what Cleckley's getting at?
Well, not exactly. Cleckley doesn't say that.
Yeah.
He just points out how tough it is to use those typical methods. And it makes sense, right? If someone's not really connecting with those deeper emotions, how much can talk therapy actually do?
It's like trying to teach someone to swim who's convinced there's no such thing as water.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Cleckley gets even more interesting. He brings up this idea of a semantic disorder to explain how psychopaths use language.
Okay, I remember that from the book, but it was a little over my head at first. Can you explain it in a way that makes sense?
Think of it like this. You know about aphasia, right? It's a language disorder where people can't really understand or use words properly. Cleckley suggests that psychopaths have a similar problem, but with emotions. They can say words like love or remorse or guilt, but they don't really carry the same weight because they lack that emotional connection.
So it's not that they're choosing to lie, it's more like they don't get the real meaning behind those words.
That's what Cleckley proposes. It's like they're speaking a different language even though they're using the same words. And this raises so many ethical questions.
Like, if their words are basically meaningless, can they be held responsible for what they do in the same way as someone who fully understands the impact of their actions?
It's a really tough question, and Cleckley really wrestles with this throughout the book. He points out that the legal system struggles with this. How do you punish someone who might not be capable of grasping the emotional and moral weight of their actions?
It's not just legal either, it affects every relationship. How can you press someone or be close to them if they might not be able to experience those same feelings?
It's definitely a huge challenge. Cleckley doesn't have all the answers, but he does argue for a more understanding and compassionate approach to psychopathy.
So he acknowledges that it's complicated, but he's not saying we should just give up, right? What does he suggest we do?
Cleckley had a few key ideas. First, he stresses how important it is to be aware and to understand. He wants to move past those sensationalized portrayals we see in the media and encourage a more informed and compassionate view of psychopathy.
Right. The more we understand something, the better we can deal with it. It's like any other complex issue, education is key.
Totally. He also calls for a more consistent and humane approach to diagnosis and treatment. Back in his day, it was often treated as a legal issue instead of a medical one. And he really felt we need to see it through a medical lens to make real progress.
Which makes sense. If there's a chance for treatment, shouldn't we be exploring it?
Right. But he's also very realistic about the limitations of traditional therapy. He knows that psychopaths might not respond to it the same way as someone struggling with depression or anxiety.
So does that mean it's hopeless? Are we supposed to just lock them up and forget about them?
No, not at all. Cleckley suggests that we need to find specific approaches that are tailored to their needs and challenges. Maybe we need to look beyond traditional talk therapy and explore other methods of management and rehabilitation.
It's almost like we need to completely change how we think about psychopathy.
You got it.
Oh.
Cleckley's work was a call to action. He wanted to shake things up in the field of psychiatry. He urged them to move beyond simple categories and develop a more nuanced and effective way of dealing with this complex disorder. It was like a challenge for future generations to keep digging and keep asking those tough questions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about Cleckley and his ideas, but I'm curious, how does all of this apply today? I mean, this book was written a long time ago. Is it still relevant to modern psychology?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And the answer is a big yes. Cleckley's work really laid the groundwork for a lot of the research and clinical practice we see today when it comes to psychopathy.
Like his focus on really observing people and those detailed case studies, that's still important, right? You can't just rely on surface judgments or stereotypes when it comes to something this complicated.
Absolutely. And his point about understanding the whole person, not just giving them a label, that's still crucial in mental health today.
And the whole Mask of Sanity idea, it's everywhere now. It's almost become a pop culture thing, even though it's maybe a little too focused on the scary side.
True, but it's still a powerful concept that helps us understand why psychopathy can go unnoticed for so long.
Yeah.
It makes us face the fact that things aren't always what they seem.
So given all the progress that's been made, are we any closer to really understanding and dealing with this condition?
There's definitely been progress in research and diagnosis, but the challenges with treatment and rehabilitation are still there. We're still grappling with some of those same ethical dilemmas that Cleckley brought up all those years ago.
It feels like we're always walking this line between trying to help people with psychopathic traits and protecting society from potential harm.
That's a great way to put it. It's a delicate balance, and there are no easy answers.
After all this, what are some key things you think our listeners should really take away from this?
Well, first, I think Cleckley wants us to look past those simple labels and stereotypes. He wants us to see these individuals as complex people, not just monsters or villains.
That's important. It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism and forget we're talking about real human beings.
He also reminds us that we need to pay attention to details and avoid making snap judgments. It's about understanding the little things in personality and behavior, not just slapping on a label.
So basically, look beyond the mask.
Exactly. And we need to be compassionate. Labeling someone as psychopathic doesn't fix anything. We need to be thinking about treatment rehabilitation and how to help these individuals while also making sure everyone is safe.
It's a tough balance, but it sounds like understanding is the first step.
Absolutely. And finally, I think Cleckley's work reminds us that even with all our scientific knowledge, we still have these big ethical questions about psychopathy. There isn't one right answer, and the discussion needs to continue.
It reminds us that the human mind is this incredibly complex and mysterious thing.
It is. And as we learn more about psychopathy, we're also learning more about ourselves and how different everyone's experiences can be.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. I'm glad we had the chance to explore this topic. You know, it's funny, as we've been talking about Cleckley, I keep thinking about that semantic disorder thing. It's such a weird idea. If they really don't have that deep connection to language, it makes you wonder about so much like how we even communicate and hold each other accountable.
Yeah, it really makes you question things.
Yeah.
Think about it. If their words don't mean the same thing to them as they do to us, how can we judge their actions based on what they say? It's like we're trying to understand a message from another planet without knowing their language or customs.
And that disconnect just makes the ethical questions even harder, right? If someone doesn't truly get what harm means on an emotional level, can we really blame them the same way we would someone who does?
That's a question that's been around forever. Cleckley doesn't act like he has all the answers, but he brings up some good points. It's like he's pointing at this really blurry area of human behavior and saying, hey, this is complicated. We need to look at this in a new way.
And then it gets even more complicated when you think about what motivates them. If they're not driven by the same things as most people, what is it? What's pushing them to do the things they do?
That's the big mystery. Cleckley noticed that they often try to show emotions, but it's all surface level. It's like a performance, not real feeling. Like they learn the lines but don't understand the meaning behind them.
So it's not that they're always intentionally lying. It's more like they're acting a part without really getting the character's motivations.
That's a good way to put it. And if it's not those deeper emotions, what is it? Cleckley thinks maybe it's more basic instincts, less about social rules or ethics.
So maybe they're operating on a totally different level with a different internal compass. And that's why their actions seem so unpredictable and confusing to everyone else.
Exactly. And that's why we need to keep researching and asking these questions. We need to understand more about the human mind, not just psychopathy, but all the ways people behave.
This has been so eye-opening. I'm realizing how much we don't know about the brain and what makes people do the things they do.
And that's what makes it so interesting, isn't it? There's always something new to learn. Cleckley's book is a perfect example of how one book can make you want to keep exploring and asking questions your whole life.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks so much for taking us on this deep dive into the Mask of Sanity. It's been fascinating.
It was my pleasure. And for our listeners, remember, the human mind is a big and complicated place. Never stop exploring, never stop asking questions, and be open to changing your mind about things.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.